All right. Welcome everyone to our Building Finance Teams for Hypergrowth event. I'm Ajay Vashee, a general partner at IVP and the former CFO of Dropbox. And I'll be moderating our discussion today, along with my partner, Michael Miao, who was one of the first hires on Dropbox's strategic finance team. And we're joined by three incredible finance leaders: Stacey Fagioli, CFO at Swoop Search and the former head of corporate finance at Stripe; Priya Fatemi, head of finance at Plaid; and Pravir Melwani, head of finance and biz ops at Figma. Each of them was one of the first senior finance leaders at their respective companies and helped scale Stripe, Plaid, and Figma into the powerhouse companies they are today. I'd also like to welcome all of our attendees joining us virtually and thank everyone for tuning in. To ask a question during today's discussion, please use the stage Q&A feature on the right side of the screen. The moderators will review submitted questions throughout the event, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can towards the end of our time together. And with that, let's kick things off. This is a very special event for Michael and me. Everyone on today's panel actually worked together at Dropbox, where we were all part of Silicon Valley's first strategic finance team. Over time, our team extended its scope beyond core FP&A to help shape the company's strategy, product, and go-to-market decisions. And today, almost every major technology company has built a similar team within the finance organization. So I thought we could kick this panel off with a brief trip down memory lane. I'd love to hear about the biggest lessons you took from your Dropbox StratFin days into your roles at Stripe, Plaid, and Figma. Stacey, perhaps we can kick things off with you.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Ajay and Miao, for having me. It's awesome to be back with the team. The biggest lesson, going off the cuff here, so I guess this is more just borrowing from Warren Buffett, and this is incidentally John Collison's favorite phrase. In the short term, the markets are a voting machine. In the long term, they are a weighing machine. So if you have a great valuation in your last round, great. Don't get too excited and spend all your money. And if your valuation is not where you wanted it to be, also don't be too sad because it is a long game. So just focus on building the business.
Great. Totally agree. Priya, would love to hear from you as well.
Thanks, Ajay and Michael, for having me on this panel. It's been some time since my Dropbox days, but honestly, I would say, well, Dropbox was my first operating role. Before Dropbox, I did some stints in venture capital and investment banking. So there are many lessons in the couple of years I spent on the StratFin team at Dropbox. But I think the biggest one was by far hiring amazing people, enabling them to succeed, and then getting out of the way. I was always amazed by all the different accomplishments of folks on our team and what they did both at Dropbox and after leaving Dropbox. So I think that's really important. I wouldn't just hire for kind of the existing need and a very specialized, especially early on, specialized skill set, really hire for potential and kind of longer term ceiling. So I think that was by far the biggest lesson.
Great. And Pravir, how about you?
Save the best for last. I think really similar to Priya. I think people are the lifeblood of your organization. Everyone has a valid opinion and deserves to be heard. I feel like this was especially relevant. Having joined the company as someone that was fairly new to an operating role as well, and just seeing how quickly the company was scaling. No person never had a perfect answer, but you were encouraged to have a voice. And I think Dropbox did a really good job of empowering people to be vested in what was being built. I remember being encouraged early and often to make decisions where I feel like I had no business making them. But that experience probably pulled me closer to the company, more vested into what was going on, and more excited to be there. And I think I've kind of taken that as a key lesson in terms of how I build teams as well.
Totally. I love the answers: valuation, hiring, and empowerment. And Michael, I'm going to throw a curveball at you at the outset of our discussion today. What have you brought to the world of investing from your time at Dropbox?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ajay, and happy to provide maybe the investor perspective. I'd say my time at Dropbox has benefited me tremendously as an investor. And I think probably the three most important things were centered around just, I think, developing context and empathy around company building, better understanding software business models, and also having a pretty robust network that I still lean on today. On the first point, I'd say it was just really valuable to see what world-class operators look like, and also having a chance to work with them. I think when you're at a hyper-growth startup like Dropbox, you get to see every single major scaling challenge a startup could possibly face. It's just really valuable to see how the best operators handle these challenges. And it gives you, I think, an appreciation as an investor around just how hard it is to build and scale these companies. And then I'd say on the second point, maybe as a growth investor, I think the job in nature is just a lot more quantitative compared to maybe what our early stage peers might experience, which is why I think working in strategic finance has served me pretty well. As everyone on this panel knows, we were in charge of building the company model, defining the metrics, understanding how strategic initiatives would flow through the P&L. And I think it really helps as a software investor to just have that mental model for how companies actually work. And I'd say, last but not least, that the network has been incredible, right? As a very relevant example, I used to work side by side with everyone on this panel. And beyond that, the Dropbox alumni group, they've all gone on to do some really amazing things, either as founders, as investors, as operators, executives, and everything else in between. So it's been tremendously valuable, and I'm really thankful for my time there.
Thank you for sharing all that, Michael. Couldn't agree more. And I'd love to talk on a related topic about team building. And today's event is focused on setting up finance teams for hypergrowth. I would love to hear what the state of the finance organization was when each of you joined your respective companies and where your organizations are today. Puya, maybe we can start with you for this question. Would love to hear when you first joined Plaid, what the state of the finance org was then and how your team looks today.
For sure. Well, there wasn't really a finance team when I joined Plaid. Back in early 2016, the company was about 25 employees, and I was hired to kind of build and scale a finance function over time. So a couple of funny examples. I think back then, our CEO, Zach, our CEO and founder, Zach, was sending customer invoices on his own and running payroll. So very, very high value CEO responsibilities, obviously, at that time. So yes, not much in terms of kind of an org. There were some financial systems in place, actually put in place by an intern we had the summer before, who actually came back and eventually became our head of product for many years. So we had some early financial systems like Gusto and an early accounting system, Xero, and a few other things, but no team and necessarily no scale processes in place. So very, very small. And do you want me to touch on where it is right now as well, or?
That'd be great. Just the contrast of when you first joined Plaid, where finance was, which was really non-existent, and then how is the team scaled today? Like the snapshot of where it was when you joined, the snapshot of where it is today.
Yeah, for sure. So today we are around 25 team members, in person, remote, in Europe as well, spread across a couple of different sub-functions from accounting, tax, treasury to FP&A, Stratfin, and really kind of amazing team members. Obviously, the role and responsibility has changed quite a bit over time. The systems have changed. The specific focus areas have changed. We've gone through many things from raising multiple equity rounds, audits, acquiring a company, almost being acquired ourselves, aborting that process, now preparing to be a sustainable long-term, independent company.
Yep. And we're excited to dig into all that, into how each of you built your teams and how the focus of your organization has evolved and shifted over time. And we have a few more questions coming up on that. But Stacy, maybe we can move over to you. Can you tell us about the finance organization at Stripe when you first joined the company? And I know you recently left Stripe to join Swoop Search as CFO. What did Stripe's finance team look like when you left?
Yeah. So when I joined Swoop, this was in mid 2015. Sorry, Stripe. They all start with us. And the company itself was already about 200 plus people, but the finance team was pretty tiny. We had 5 accountants and 2 like part-time contractors who worked on payroll and accounting. And then I was the first kind of non-accounting hire onto the team. So a grand total of 8 people, if you will. And then when I left Stripe in close to the end of 2020, the finance team was over 100 people. I think it was actually about 130 people across, accounting, tax, internal audit, treasury, obviously big for a payments company, finance and strategy, which is what we call sort of like FP&A in our strategy, pricing, competitive landscape, investor relations, and corporate strategy. So it was a massive organization.
Totally. And Pravir, how has the finance team at Figma changed over time?
I probably had similar experiences as Puya. It was non-existent when I joined. We were I think it was probably about 25, 30 people across the company. But we were pre-revenue at the time, and so there was not a lot that needed to be managed. We had an outsourced bookkeeping firm, and then most stuff was set to either auto pay or even our payroll was automated at that point to just go out at the end of each pay period. I think some of the more hilarious board decks that went out at that time, we had a budget that I remember finding that was just, obviously we're a design company, a bunch of shapes on a page to show where big dollars were being spent, but that quickly changed. Today, across the orgs, so across the company, we're about 450 people. The teams that I'm spending time with, so it's most of the teams outside of the people and talent team on the G&A side, but specific probably to this conversation, the folks on accounting and finance are about 12 or 13 right now, mostly on the accounting side. So we have a technical accounting team, an AR team, AP team, payroll. We were actually able to go through our first financial audit this year, which was exciting. And then on the finance side, so we have a strategic finance leader. She has 2 individuals on her team and are looking to hire aggressively there. 2 folks on the biz up side and one person on corporate development.
Okay, got it. Well, that's a great tee up and segue to our next question. A related topic that's top of mind for many in the audience today is how to focus and prioritize recruiting efforts when you're first setting up your finance organization. And Pravir, maybe we can stay with you for this question out of the gate. You were the first finance hire at Figma, like Puya was at Plaid. Which part of the organization did you build out first, and how did you kind of sequence that org building over time?
Yeah. So we slow rolled kind of building our team. So it was probably about a year until I hired someone. But I hired like a super hungry biz ops sort of generalist individual who came with a finance background and some experience at a scale company before. I think he dabbled in probably every part of the organization, which was perfect for what we needed. So he did everything from owning our corporate model, heavy data analysis, like early sales ops, early partnerships. Was like a big glue guy for the organization, I felt. And I think if I think about like the critical ones that I've then since made, it's been the ones that have been hiring for areas that have been gaps in my own personal expertise. So hiring an accounting director was absolutely huge for me. It was like after he joined that I really started to be able to put structures in place and processes and really started to pull a lot of the accounting process in-house. Built out our order to cash process, transitioned to new systems. So that's when we made the transition from like a Carta to a Carta or even Avalara for sales tax. And then I think similarly on the legal side, I was completely out of scope for what I knew. And I think that initially I thought that this person would spend a whole bunch of time on the commercial side of the business, but ended up becoming super instrumental in all parts. Corporate, was a partner to the product org and people org, helping us with international expansion, IP and patent strategy, and just building a phenomenal team. And so those 2 have been major unlocks for me, and I've learned a ton from them over time.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. Puya, you joined Plaid at a similar stage to Pravir. Same question to you. How did you approach team and org building? And on a related note, are there any hires that you wish you'd made sooner?
Yes, great question. I think this is the first couple of quarters is absolutely critical, and really sets the stage for what the finance org, well, how you can partner with the business, how much impact you have, and what the finance org will do longer term. So I think it's really important to get it right the first couple of quarters. So the first hire was our first controller, who came from Optimizely and had a prior background at a Big Four audit firm. And the reason I prioritized that over some of the other roles was just really to complement my skill set. Having spent time previously at Dropbox on the Stratfin team and prior to Dropbox in investing and banking roles, I really had not a ton of exposure to financial systems and kind of really early stage compliance and tax and processes. So it was really important to have someone in place as soon as possible to really make sure we're not missing anything critical on that side. Maybe a little bit less important depending on your business model and your industry, but with Plaid being kind of a player within the financial services ecosystem and having to partner not just with fintech startups, but also large financial institutions and over time, kind of government agencies and regulators, it was really important for us to have highly compliant operations. So we ended up prioritizing a controller hire initially. I made that hire 6 months into my role. I just hear a question of what I wish I had done kind of faster or better, like maybe made that hire 3 months earlier. It would have definitely saved a lot of stress and white hair over the long term. So that was the first hire. The second hire, we ended up making a very strong kind of generalist athlete to take on a kind of a hybrid strategic finance and business operations role. Similar mandate as what Praveer mentioned in terms of roles and responsibilities. And to my earlier point on hiring amazing people, I mean, this individual has gone on to build a standalone 20-person plus business operations team. So adding a ton of impact across all of Plaid. So did you have any other components of the question, Ajay, you want me to touch on?
Just your overall sequencing and approach to team building, which we're getting a good sense for, and then some of those critical hires that you wish you had brought on sooner.
Yeah, for sure. I think, so on the controller side, a little bit early on, and then beyond the first few hires, I would then kind of like look at your business needs, where the biggest needs are, where the biggest holes are, where you can add the most value.
Yep. Totally. Stacy, can you share some perspective on how you scaled the corporate finance team at Stripe and on how you're approaching team building today at Swoop Search?
Yeah, sure. So Stripe was obviously in a bit of a different spot. We already had a separate accounting organization that I was not in charge of. So for finance and strategy, which was the team I was on, my first hire was also a general athlete who did not have a ton of kind of in-house corporate experience, corporate or operational experience, but had more sort of like the investing kind of experience. And echo what Puya and Praveer said, it depends on the needs of your business. For Stripe, very specifically, the focus back then was not on financial reporting or holding people accountable to budgets because we just basically had a lot of cash. And so the focus really was on, more like special projects, business operations. And so a general athlete profile made more sense back then. At Swoop, I am actually right where Puya and Praveer were when they started at Plaid and Figma respectively. And I think my first hire will be a controller as well. Again, because of the business's needs. Swoop is very heavy in defense, and the government has all sorts of requirements of their vendors. And I just want to make sure we're compliant. And also to echo Puya's point, you want to hire for your weakness, right? So I don't have a strong accounting background, and that's definitely somewhere where I want to complement my skill set.
Sure. That makes sense. And thank you for sharing that context, Stacy. I will pass things over to Michael for our next few questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay. And also a huge thanks to all the panelists for joining us today. It's super fun and nostalgic to see you guys all again. And this has been an awesome conversation so far. I'm learning a ton. So, one of the things that I think we're observing across our entire portfolio is that having a high functioning finance team, it's no longer a nice to have. It really has become a need to have. And what we're seeing in our portfolio is that finance teams are becoming increasingly strategic. They're now involved in informing major decisions across things like go-to-market, product, and operations, not just traditional corporate finance. So I'd love to hear from the panelists about how their team's priorities and scope has changed over time and just the level of impact they've been able to make. And maybe Puya, I'll start off with you. How has your team's scope and responsibility changed during your time at Plaid?
Yeah, great question. So I think generally the scope will, just by the pure fact that the company is growing, the scope will narrow in terms of breadth, but it'll get deeper. I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we first started building the finance team, it wasn't like we had every other business team built out, fully with leaders and ICs in place. So in my first few years, we had to take on various responsibilities that you may not kind of traditionally associate with finance, right? So at times, I had to work, and manage even our people team, times compliance, business operations at one point was part of the finance org as well. Funny enough, I think in my first year, I was even working with our go-to-market team to negotiate contracts with customers, which you definitely do not want a head of finance negotiating with another head of finance. It definitely does not lead to very successful long-term relationships. So yeah, it really depends on kind of where you are and what other leaders you have across the organization. So it was a very kind of wide breadth, and kind of we had to kind of plug in very different pieces that were missing. In terms of kind of hiring athletes, we've had folks who've even done some product work from time to time. So I would say over time, the breadth gets a little bit smaller, and you go deeper. In terms of impact, you're absolutely right. The impact is still very strategic and perhaps even more strategic. We're obviously driving the annual planning processes that ensures we deploy capital appropriately across the various strategic priorities of the business. We have a very important responsibility, and I think this is actually one of the highest areas of impact, to ensure that our team members, partners, investors, regulators, et cetera, have utmost confidence in the quality of our business and financial model, and kind of believe the numbers, trust numbers, believe in the transparency that we're providing, get the data that they need for decision making and the insights that they need. So I think that's super important and one of the things that we're most proud of. But you're absolutely right. Like, we're deeply involved in assessing new market opportunities, working with our go-to-market and product teams to assess business model and pricing model for adjacent new opportunities and products, and also ensuring that our core business continues to perform at a reasonable pace and with attractive financial profile.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Well, Stacy, maybe I'll go to you next. Stripe's pretty well known for having a really high-performing corporate finance team that is quite mature, per your comment. I'd love to hear about how your team's priorities and scope changed while you're at the company. And as maybe a follow-up to that, I'd love to hear also just how that's influenced how you're currently thinking about building out your own team at Swoop today.
Okay, yeah, so the role definitely changed a lot. So when we first started, it was a lot of, like I mentioned before, a lot of decisioning support, I would say, and a lot of helping leadership frame things in financial terms. So, for example, one of the biggest debates that we were having when I first joined Stripe was, should Stripe service enterprise customers? Because as I'm sure a lot of you know, Stripe's kind of like bread and butter was developers and small businesses. And, the founders have a huge passion for developers and all of that. And we didn't want to waste our time on large and slow and boring enterprise customers. And one of the first things we did was just kind of frame that in terms of like a financial, a financial framework. What would the enterprise value of the company be if we were to just focus on developers? And what could the enterprise value of your company be if you were to expand? Not to say that enterprise value is the be all end all, right? Like you can build any sort of business you want. But just to illustrate as an example, like the kinds of questions and projects and decisions that finance would kind of support. So a lot of ad hoc projects, pricing, sort of like a catch-all for any sort of analytical work. And then over time, as similar to the trajectory that Puya mentioned, you start to get more specialized in terms of functions, and corporate finance started to play a very huge role in terms of overall company budgeting, a lot of company planning. It actually got to the point where when we set strategic goals, it was no longer simply like product led, right? Like this is what we want to build, and I don't care what finance says. And it became a lot of like, hey, finance, where do you think we should be revenue wise next year? Where do you think we should be, like, in terms of certain metrics? So there was that evolution, and then in terms of fundraising, I would say in terms of like capital raises, there was an evolution in terms of, your shareholder base starts to rotate, right? At first, it's a lot of like early stage VC people. And then as the company matures, you start to have more hedge funds, you start to have more public company or crossover investors. And so the nature of, diligence, the nature of reporting, the nature of your interactions with them evolves over time. We also started having a lot of banking relationships similar to Plaid. And so corporate finance was also, you just had to be a little bit more buttoned up in terms of your presentations, your content, your materials, your forecasts. And so that all kind of evolved. So that was like the overall evolution. In terms of translating it to Swoop, I think it's a little bit early because Swoop is only 30 people. I think the general trajectory makes sense. I think when a company is fairly like early, you don't want to stifle it too much with like financial forecasts and targets. Like guardrails are important, but you don't want to like overdo it. And so I think if I were to do it again, based on what I know right now, at least at Swoop, it will follow a similar trajectory.
Got it. And Pravir, maybe going to you, we actually caught up a few weeks back, and you mentioned that you're currently building out Figma's strategic finance team, and you also said earlier on in this panel that you just hired a head of strategic finance. I know that function, it's still early internally at Figma, but I'd love to hear about just the types of projects that your team has worked on, and maybe if you could speak to just the types of impact or the level of impact that your company has had to date. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I think like maybe the way I can frame it is I'll speak about like what types of things that I was able to work on before I hired that team, and then where they are today. So I think like if I rewind maybe 3-4 years ago, I felt like a lot of what we were doing was reactive to the business. So it was performance management over anything. We were at that point where we were early in monetization and really needed to stand up a lot of the data models, funnel analysis, and reporting structures. So those were like really core to what we needed to do at the time. And the primary goal was just making sure that we as a team understood that we had a strong pulse for what was going on. Now that we have an actual strategic finance team and we're actually growing that team pretty quickly, I think what we can be doing is less reactive and more oriented to how do we help the broader organization identify future challenges as they might emerge. So the leader that we brought on, she came from Salesforce and had been there for, I think it was almost 9 or 10 years. And one of the things that I really enjoyed, the framework that she had started to put into place, was a process for how we think about the long-term, or like a long range sort of planning model that we have. So something that goes out 5 years and plays out the implications of the decisions that we make today, and how they we're at that crossroads where we have to make these really interesting product investment decisions that will impact our go-to-market structure, our target audiences. But if we don't kind of address those in its current form and function, we could end up, each part of the organization ends up building its own sort of view of that, and without a consolidated and targeted sort of outcome there, I think you default potentially flying blind. And so I think like that level of clarity and foresight is what I'm hoping to continue to be able to do. And as we add new people to that team, my hope is that they can now start to disseminate that same sort of North Star to the teams that they're then supporting.
Awesome. And maybe moving on to our next question and topic. And I think, as everyone knows on this panel, startup journeys, they're not always up and to the right. Sometimes things break, mistakes are made, but you're supposed to learn from them and make sure that you don't make the same mistake twice. So I think one thing that our audience would love to hear about is just getting a sense of, what were the biggest mistakes, our panelists have made in their current and past roles, in what lessons, they took from that in the process. Maybe, Stacey, I'll start with you. I'd love to hear about just the biggest mistakes either you or your team had made at Stripe. And, if you could do it all over again, is there anything maybe you would have done differently?
Yes. So I guess it's hard to say because there's no counterfactual, but I think if I had to do it differently, I would have, and it was so hard to just while you're in the situation, just anticipate how quickly the company's growing and how quickly things are growing or things are changing. But if I could do it again, I would actually start rotating in people with different backgrounds soon. I would have done that sooner. So for context, my team was there were a lot of ex-bankers and ex-investors. And there definitely was a period of time when not all of them had the appropriate skill set or mindset to do F&S work that was required of a larger company. And so if I could do it sooner, and then subsequently we brought in incredible people from places that I never thought to look because I previously did not have that experience. We brought in people who were from accounting backgrounds, from advisory backgrounds, from GE, just amazing people who actually, I think, could have done a lot of the biz ops and strategic work as well, just as well as some of the other people. I just never thought to look. I never sort of realized the value of a diverse background or diverse team until, things got really, really challenging. Of course, we fixed it, but I think that's one lesson I took with me.
Got it. Puya, maybe moving on to you. What were maybe the biggest lessons you learned at Plaid, and what pitfalls should startups avoid?
Yeah, good question. So I'll give one example that's probably relevant for many folks, and then another one that is probably more specific to Plaid, but perhaps in a wider setting could be more relevant as well. I think on the first one, I would say one thing that kind of generally I would have done faster if I could go back is kind of replace some of the early stage systems before the business gets too big and too complex to easily transition. This could be anything from your accounting system to whatever it is, right? Like your equity system, payroll, etc. I think many folks first of all, it's not my background, so it was hard for me to kind of see what's behind the corner down the line. But it just becomes much harder when you have thousands of customers to move off to another billing solution. When you have years of audited financials to change your accounting system. So really identify what you need a year, 2 years down the line, and start to transition as fast as you can. And that requires, as Stacey mentioned, you can't just hire the same background over and over. You need to have a diversity of opinions and backgrounds. And I feel kind of related to what Stacey mentioned, because so many of the first few folks we hired had this investing, banking, kind of Stratton background. We probably underinvested in changing some of those systems early on, which caused a little bit of headache. You can fix it down the line, but it becomes more painful, unnecessarily painful. So that's one example. A more specific example, which I think was probably if I were to look back, the biggest mistake we made, or I guess I made at Plaid, was it is a unique situation for us. Some folks may know we signed a merger agreement with Visa in January of 2020, 2 months before COVID started becoming a pandemic. So we were under a merger agreement, the pandemic hit, Obviously, like capital markets were frozen for a period of time. We have a lot of startup customers. Their businesses were getting impacted. We were starting to be a little bit more cautious about, okay, like what was going to be the impact of this on our business, right? We were under a merger agreement. We can't raise money, obviously. That, or at least not under the traditional structures of raising equity financing. There wouldn't be any upside. Credit markets are frozen, so we can't raise debt. We haven't raised money in 3 years because obviously the merger agreement discussion started in 2019, and we didn't think it would take that long, or that a pandemic would hit. So we became very cautious in kind of managing our runway, and we ended up slowing down hiring in Q2 and Q3 of 2020. Lo and behold, credit markets open up again. Business is booming. Digital finance is just growing exponentially in the second half of 2020 and early into 2021, and we ended up playing a bit of a catch up on some of the new product areas and new opportunities, which we've resolved since then. But again, we lost some time that we didn't need to. I guess the learning for me, I'm sure like I'm not gonna see the same set of circumstances again. I hope not. But really, it's if you have confidence in the long-term trajectory of the business, don't let kind of short-term fluctuations kind of impact your longer-term plans, and continue to invest aggressively. I guess if we could kind of go back, I'd be a little bit more creative in how we could, remedy some of those concerns that wouldn't require slowing down hiring, for instance.
All right. Well, knock on wood. Praveer, maybe onto you. Would love to get your thoughts. I mean, what was your biggest mistake at Figma? And, if you could do it again, what would you do differently?
Yeah, definitely a few things I'd do differently. I think had I known the business would have exploded as quickly as it did, I probably would have hired faster and earlier. And I think I would focus on getting systems in place, but don't stress if they aren't perfect, because you're going to have to rip them out and do it over again because the business is changing so quickly. So focus on things that are good enough, but don't have to be perfect. And then I think as and when you feel like you're maturing, that's when you need to double down there. I think that I've come to appreciate the value of transparency within organizations. So I think you never know who on your team is going to have a fantastic idea. And I think an openness to listening and be open to feedback. I think I felt this early where I felt like I needed to be the person that had all the answers. And I don't think that was true. And I think the level of transparency that we could or should have had and the level of trust that I should have had more of would have enabled probably a more collaborative process and faster decision making. And then I think the last thing that I'd say, I wish I leaned into my personal network faster and earlier and more often, because it's unbelievable how willing people are to help. And I think that you when you're in the moment, you feel like you're the only person that's going through something. But I think the reality is, like, so many people have addressed very similar sort of topics and conversations that you're probably going through at the same time. So I mean, there have been moments not too long ago where I've texted both Puya and Stacy, asked them questions for things that I'm working on, and so I encourage everyone to do that. And there's value in being able to kind of just gut check things faster.
That was awesome, guys. Well, maybe for the next question, I'd like to maybe pivot the conversation to a quick lightning round. So for each of the panelists, I'd love to hear their responses to the following questions. So 1, what is your team's favorite finance software tool? 2, what is the team that is always asking for more budget during annual planning? And then 3, as a finance leader, what individual specific metric are you most laser focused on? And Praveer, since you just went last, I'll start with you. I'd love to get your thoughts.
This is like aside from Excel, right? Like you got to pick something.
Aside from Excel, yes.
Okay. If you pushed me, I probably would say, I think we were oriented on building really strong business systems and processes. And so a whole bunch of them are built on the back of Snowflake at this point. And so we use Snowflake as our system of record. That means like all of our funnel data, all of our business application data has to go there. But I think what's really interesting is how you can get data out. We use a tool called Census that helps us kind of funnel all that information from those business applications into the places where our end users kind of need them. So it'll translate data to Salesforce, Marketo, Zendesk, NetSuite, wherever you're kind of using it, and just simplifies the way that we do everything. What team asks for the most budget? I mean, honestly, we like struggled to think big at the beginning, and I probably hold that on me for like holding the keys a little bit too tight. No one team jumps out. I think the go-to-market org scales. When the go-to-market org starts to scale, it starts to astound you how large the supporting functions need to be. Nothing that I don't think that we weren't prepared for, but I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you hire one quota-carrying rep, and then the individuals around them that you start to realize that you need. There's a lot. Yeah. And sorry, was there another question, or that was the two, right?
No. The other question, the last question was, what specific metric?
My favorite metric.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I think, I mean, we're just in like heavy growth market share sort of grab mode. And so I mean, the few things that I'm looking at daily, like what was our sign up volume over the past prior week? I mean, we're a freemium business, so that's really important. It drives our entire funnel. What is the quality of that sign up? And then ultimately, what does conversion look like both on our pipeline creation side, but also like our conversion from on our self-serve business?
Got it. So Stacy, you're next. So that's favorite finance tool, budget requests, and most important or favorite metric that you track.
Okay, I was gonna say Excel. And it's so embarrassing to hear how sophisticated Figma is, because neither Swoop nor Stripe actually was that sophisticated. I think our favorite finance tool at Stripe was probably whatever the data science team was using. We actually leaned a lot on data science. They developed an embedded model, and we had a few really great data science partners to help us with things ranging from forecasting to analysis. So whatever they were using, it was great. Let's see, the second one, what was the second question?
It was, what team's always asking for more budget during annual planning?
Yeah, so for both Stripe and Swoop, it was engineering, product and engineering, which is, obviously fine. It's a product and engineering led business. The challenge for finance is always, it's hard to put metrics around engine product to measure productivity. And so it's not so much I have an issue with the teams asking for budget. It's more that it's hard to kind of make it a little bit more scientific. Whereas for GTM, you can think about it in terms of quotas, and like revenue productivity is just harder for engine and product. And then let's see, the last question. Sorry, I keep forgetting last question.
Favorite metric that you track, or whatever metric that you're most focused on.
Yeah, also a growth-oriented metric for now. It's revenue. There's a lot of capital out there, so as long as you're growing your revenue.
Got it. And then Puyo, let's end with you. So just a reminder, just favorite finance tool. Which team is always asking for more budget during planning, and what specific metric are you most focused on at Plaid?
Good question. So on the first one, it's probably a little bit of kind of unexpected answer. I would say it's our in-house billing system. Well, it's more of like a love and hate relationship. We have a diverse product portfolio, kind of different types of data, different types of connections, different periods of access. So they each have kind of somewhat of a unique pricing model. And we're always introducing new products. So it's our overall kind of like pricing model is a bit of a usage, primarily usage, but also some kind of more traditional SaaS features built in. So it's actually very difficult to find an external solution that can fully service kind of a billing engine like that. So we've been always very grateful when we get engineering resources from our CTO, who actually used to work at Dropbox as well, and it's fantastic. But it's just like really, really helpful to be able to have that in-house system and to be able to customize it and kind of build the automations that are necessary over time, so that we can we can go from 1,000 customers to 2, 3, 4, 5,000 customers and not have to add 30 revenue accountants to the team and AR specialists to the team, right? We've been able to go scale out revenue like more than 100x, going from 1 revenue accountant to 3 revenue accountants. And the only reason it's possible is because we have this in-house system built in, and from time to time we build additional automation and connectivity to make it work even better. So that would be my favorite tool. Second question, which team asks for more budget most often? Well, I think, I don't know, maybe it's different at Stripe and Figma, but like at Plaid, I feel like everyone or almost everyone asks for more budget all the time. But it's part of the process. We do top down and both top down and bottoms up planning processes, so it tends to happen often. I think that the biggest delta typically happens with some of the new initiatives that we fund, new product initiatives that are a little bit more of a longer term bet. And it's kind of tough early on in a top down planning process to get a sense for exactly what those opportunities would be for the next year and the year after that. So that tends to be kind of the biggest delta, and almost always it's going up given all the new ideas that our CEO and rest of the leadership team have. Last question. The most important metrics. So we serve 3 different constituencies: consumers or end users, developer customers, and financial institutions. So there are like specific metrics on each that I care a lot about. On the consumer front, it's number of kind of weekly average new bank account connections by end users, which kind of speaks to the volume of impact we have and kind of how much we're able to help people with their financial lives, and kind of the usage on the platform. The second one on the developer side is kind of we make our money from developers. So it's kind of our version of annualized recurring revenue from developers, as well as developer signups. We do have a bit of a freemium model as well, although probably not quite as extensive as what Preview has at Figma. And then on the financial institution side, it's kind of the quality of our connections with financial institutions, the stability of those connections, and kind of where we are in the transition to kind of more formalized access methods.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Leah. So maybe I'll hand it back to Ajay to close things out.
All right, those were all great and very insightful answers. Thank you, Michael. We have one more topic to cover as part of our moderated discussion before we move into audience Q&A. And as a reminder for those in the audience, to submit a question for our panelists, please use the stage Q&A feature on the right side of the screen. And we have a number of questions that have been submitted, so thank you for those. Final topic. There are a number of founders and CEOs in the audience today that are thinking about hiring their first finance leader. What advice would you have for them? What kind of profile should they prioritize? Where might they look to find the right talent? And Praveer, perhaps we can start with you to get your perspective first.
Yeah. Some points of advice. So this is speaking from, so I think our CEO didn't really know what he was going to get with me. I think he was probably told just take a flyer and see what happens. But I think like the things that, the piece of advice that I would give to others, don't paint your finance person into a corner. I think closing your books and making sure you get paid on time are great, but like you want someone who's really excited to get embedded in the organization and see themselves as a partner to the organization. You want someone who's gonna be able to sell the dream probably and articulate the company vision probably nearly as good as you can, and can do that even before they join, or has like a passion to be able to do that and articulate even before they join. And finally, like once you hire that person, just throw as much at them as they can handle. And I think you'd be surprised at what parts of the organization they could potentially build or have ownership over. And if they do have that, like the mental model or the way of framing their thinking there, could actually be really helpful to the organization, especially early on. And I think your question around where to find great people, I'm biased, but I mean, I think generally folks with some sort of professional services background, I think is really helpful. You know that they're going to work hard. You know that they're thinking about things in a really structured manner. And I think some experience in a high growth environment is helpful. But I think like the piece that's hard to test for, and I think it's something that you can definitely you should back channel on, is like how much access does that individual have to a strong network? Because as an individual, as a first finance individual, you're almost going to be on an island, and you're going to have a lot of questions, and you're going to want that. And you as a CEO or founder may not have the answers, but you want that finance individual to know where to look. And I think that's immensely valuable, or that proved immensely valuable for me. And I think like you probably want that of the person that you're hiring too.
Yep, I think that's such a powerful point on network. Stacy, how about you? What advice would you give a founder or CEO that's looking to make their first finance hire?
Yeah, +1 to pretty much everything Praveer said. You definitely want someone who can live and breathe the business almost as much as you can, because this person, especially if you're giving this person like a C-level title, right? Like this person is going to be interfacing maybe a lot with external parties, interfacing with your board members. So making sure that you guys are both very aligned, very passionate about business is very important. However, I would also say, I often talk to CEOs and they were like, oh yeah, I want someone who's going to like get excited with me about product strategy, et cetera, et cetera. Great, go for that. But also remember that at the end of the day, finance is a bit of a control function. So you do also want to make sure the person who is excited and loves product and whatnot also has the appetite to get into like the nitty gritty of finance. They're going to go into your spreadsheets and your accounting systems, and they're going to push back on you when you want to spend a lot of money on X, Y, and Z. So just making sure you find that balance.
Yep, I think that's a great point on finding the right balance. And finally, Puya, what advice would you give to a CEO that's looking to make that first finance hire?
I think Stacy and Praveer covered a lot of what I would have recommended as well. So I'm not going to repeat those points. I'll add a couple of other ones. I would say don't just hire for today's scale. Keep in mind what you may need 2-3 years down the line, given the trajectory of your business, and hire someone who you're confident is able to kind of scale with the growth of your business. And this could be, you could test for it in the interview process. You could kind of filter for folks who've seen that before. It's very important. It's just really hard on the organization to change leaders like every 1 to 2 years. So if you can find someone who can scale for 3, 4, 5 years, that would be fantastic. And everyone at some point likely will hit a ceiling, and you may have to like hire someone else. Like you don't need to go hire a public, ex-public company CFO to come and be the head of finance for a 20-person startup, right? But at the same time, make sure you're hiring someone that can take the team to 5, 10, 15, 20 people in the next couple of years, and at least scale your revenue 10x, right? If you have that trajectory. So I would kind of filter for someone who can think about what it takes to scale and can actually do it. Another recommendation is to test for whether this person can be a strong recruiter. Obviously, like as Praveer mentioned, like you're just one person, and there's only so much you can do and so much you got to be able to sell the vision, and you got to be able to attract talent to join the organization to multiply your impact, right? It doesn't matter how smart you are or how hard you work. There's only certain hours and certain number of initiatives you can take on yourself. So being able to recruit really, really strong people is also very important, I would say. But yeah, outside of that, like, I totally agree with Stacy. Hire someone who like understands the business, understands the technical aspects of our product as well, because they're just not going to be able to get respect and be a good cross-functional partner if all they know is how to do finance. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that this person understands their longer-term goal is to own this function.
Yep. Yeah, being a talented recruiter, and arguably is one of the most important, if not the most important element of the job from my perspective as well. But thank you each for sharing such thoughtful perspectives. It's time to move into audience Q&A. Michael, perhaps we can ask each of our panelists one of the top questions that were submitted.
Yeah, sounds good. And thanks to the audience for submitting such great questions. So I'll direct these to each of the panelists. So maybe I'll start with Stacy. And the reason I'm asking this to Stacy is she actually wrote an awesome blog post like 5 years ago about all the different functions in finance. And I think she'd be a great person to handle this. So the question is, can you discuss the differences in responsibilities between strategic finance, FP&A, biz ops, corporate development, and just, maybe at Stripe, how you organize them?
Okay, I'll talk about corp dev first. That's really easy. Corp dev, at Stripe at least, was associated with making M&A decisions and also investing Stripe's corporate cash. Different companies may define it slightly differently, but that's, I think, the most common definition I've seen. Strategic finance, biz ops, and FP&A. So strategic finance and biz ops are kind of like catch-all terms for like general athlete teams, and the scope is really kind of how you want to define it at each company. I would say most strategic FP&A tends to be a subset of strategic finance in the sense that, FP&A is concerned with reporting financials. So like accounting is like they book all the financials, right? FP&A does like a little bit of transformation where you transform accounting numbers into numbers that the business understands. So for example, if you go onto a 10K filing, you only see like 5 numbers in the P&L. Obviously that's not what the business looks at. So FP&A does a bit of that translation for reporting, and then FP&A does the forecasting and measures the business against the forecast. Strategic finance typically would do that aspect of it, and then I would say like plus, right? And the plus really depends on the organization. At Stripe, a lot of it, as I mentioned, was decisioning support, just like one-off random decisions that had to be made. And then at Dropbox, it was a lot of other things. It was investor relations, it was capital raising, it was actually a lot of corp dev work in the early days before we had a formal corp dev team. So it really is kind of what you want to make of it. And I would say biz ops is a little bit of the same thing, but biz ops typically does not have that FP&A kind of component to it.
Awesome, super helpful. So the next question from the audience, I'm going to direct at Puya. So the question is, how do you hire for a role where you have very limited experience? For example, controller, accounting director, and what signal do you look for to determine strong candidates?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's definitely not easy. And I would say, like, particularly if you're a product-focused CEO looking to hire a controller, it's even more challenging. So I'm not sure if this question was if you're like head of finance and you're trying to hire all these various specialties on the team, but you don't have prior experience, what do you test for? Or if you're the CEO and you have like absolutely no experience whatsoever in finance.
Well, maybe let's take the question for you. I mean, you mentioned that, one of, I think your gaps was sort of having, expertise in like technical accounting, and you brought on a controller, and you probably had never hired a controller before that. So how did you learn how to do that? And what signals did you look for to determine whether or not that candidate was the right candidate to hire? Okay,
good. Thanks for adding that additional frame. So first of all, you gotta learn a little bit about like what the role is. Understand the roles and responsibilities. Understand what makes a good candidate, what makes a bad candidate. You can do your own research. You can probably some level of like helpfulness. More importantly, you can probably tap your network, right? Talk to folks who have made similar hires in the past. What did they look for? What ended up working well for them? What would they do different if they could go back in time? Talk to some strong, like, let's say like, you're the head of finance, no accounting background, and you're trying to hire a controller. Find like, reach out to your VC investors, get introductions to controllers at, their kind of later stage portfolio companies and speak to them, right? What makes a great controller? What background should I be looking for? What should I be testing, right? At the end of the day, like, you're not going to become an expert, but you can find some shortcuts to kind of at least assessing, pretty mediocre talent from potentially great talent. You have to learn a little bit about the role, as I mentioned. You know, otherwise it's just really hard. And then last is, you know, you just at some point you gotta just make a judgment call, right? And the first few are more difficult, and could, you know, those are the ones that could go wrong. But it becomes easier as you get more and more experts into the team, and kind of they have additional layers of expertise, and you can have like a more legitimate cross-functional and cross-team panel to help make that assessment. So rely on network, learn about a role a little bit, and eventually you have to just make a judgment call.
Awesome. Couldn't agree more, especially around just the calibration point you mentioned, and tapping your, you know, VCs to introduce you to, you know, what are the best professionals in their network and portfolio. So maybe we'll end off with Praveer. And this is another question from the audience. What is the most powerful planning exercise you do with investors and executive teams?
Yeah, I'll make this one quick. I think it's the one that I was sharing earlier around the long range planning exercise. The piece that we end up doing, we paint a whole bunch of different scenarios for what the business could look like, depending on what different audience we end up serving or what different sort of product roadmap we end up going down. It leads us to like a really clear narrative to say, hey, this is one path. These are the decisions and prioritization frameworks that we need to make in order to do that. This is another one. These are the challenges that present itself well over there. And then it's really clear sort of the decision-making framework that we need to make today that, again, helps us align on what that North Star exercise should be.
Yep, I love the approach to scenario analysis and building that muscle as early on as you can. And Stacy, Puya, and Praveer, we're up on time. Thank you so much for joining Michael and me today and for engaging in what was a very thoughtful discussion. A big thank you to all of our attendees for tuning in from across the world. We hope you found today's panel informative and helpful. And Michael and I will be following up with a blog post in a couple of weeks that summarizes key takeaways from our discussion today. So please be on the lookout for that. And finally, I'd like to extend my gratitude to our event co-sponsor today, Mosaic, an exciting company that's building some pretty transformational finance analytics and planning tools. So panelists, a software product to potentially check out for your organizations. A big thank you to Mosaic. We hope to see everyone soon at our next event in a few months. So thank you all. Goodbye, and thank you.